Our goal is to inform you about what's going on in our fair city, so you have a chance to participate. I want to welcome and thank Nick Zorns and Gabe England. Gabe England is the city manager, and Nick Zorns is the development service manager. They're going to speak to us again this evening about the housing element, and this is your opportunity. There'll be lots of questions, time for questions and answers today. So when they're finished, we'll have at it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. All right, so good evening, everyone. I'm Nick Zorns, the Development Services Director here at the City of Los Altos. So I know quite a few of you have been in the room in the last couple of months to listen, learn, and discuss about the housing element and the implementing ordinances that have been coming before the Planning Commission and the City Council. So I do know that for some of you this is going to be repetitive, but there are again some new faces even from last week. So to some degree I'm going to cover things that some of you have heard and then potentially expand on some of the things that I've notated previously, but we'll kind of add some additional information as I go. So tonight we are here to discuss the housing element implementation. As Freddie Wheeler just stated, is that this is a LAR hosted event that myself and the city manager are participating to provide community information and the space and time for that. So with that is that the background for the housing element, or the sixth cycle, as you'll commonly hear us refer to at the city, is something that the City Council adopted in January earlier this year, as we were required to do so by January 31, 2023. The adopted housing element, as it is for all jurisdictions in the state of California, does require us to adopt various programs which further implement housing policy from various housing laws that have been adopted over the last decade in the state of California. As an overview, a housing element is a required component of the city's general plan. The general plan, a lot of times if you talk to one of the planners in Los Altos, we'll refer to it as our blueprint and our guiding principle document for the city. And this isn't just for planning and for land use. This goes across transportation, safety, environmental, so on and so forth. So it is a multi-pronged document. This happens to just be one of the 7 main required elements in the general plan. The housing element, however, is one of the few elements that is required by state statute to be updated every 8 years. And so right now, again, we're in what is called the 6th cycle housing element, which runs in our region from 2023 to 2031. Now, one thing I will at least just say for information sharing purposes is if you were to Google 6th cycle housing element California, you would see jurisdictions in Southern California that have different due dates. So it does go by region, because obviously, you know, we have over 500 incorporated jurisdictions in the state of California. It would be impossible to review them all at the same due date. So the San Francisco Bay Area is due as of January 31, which started that 6th cycle 8-year period. The California Department of Housing and Community Development, or HCD, as you'll most commonly hear to us referred here at the city, is the state level agency that has the review authority of any housing elements in the state. So just to kind of cover the main components, we're not going to go into super big detail about all of these, because all 7 of the main components is what ends up creating a housing element. But there's a housing needs assessment, the housing constraints, existing programs which are reviewed. So essentially the previous 5th cycle reviewed, and then essentially an adaptation of what had been previously successful or what didn't really take off successfully in that cycle. Housing resources that are available or will be available during the planning period. Sites inventory and the methodology that you have to use in order to find sites to have on the inventory. Affirmatively furthering fair housing, or something that you'll also hear me refer to in an acronym, is AFFH. That is a newer requirement that was a significant change from the 5th to the 6th cycle. And then overall, with what you're all here essentially because you've heard about some of the goals, policies, and programs, are really kind of the roadmap of how you'll implement your housing element. So one of the big things that has been obviously heavily discussed and obviously an area of concern in the community, and this is something that almost every single jurisdiction has kind of a sticking point with the community, is your sites inventory, or truly what the community would call is the rezone parcels. So with that, I'm not going to read over everything that ends up going into what is the site's inventory, but essentially the regional or county, or not county, the Council of Governments, or COG, C-O-G, that's another acronym, is we are in ABAG, which is the Bay Area COG, and they have to establish and assign each jurisdiction in ABAG, or the San Francisco Bay Area, their regional allocation of the housing needs. Now, Los Altos, obviously, the community very well knows is that we were assigned just under 2,000 housing units for the 8-year planning period. That is just a small fraction of the entire cumulative number that was assigned to the entire Bay Area. So if you are Mountain View, Palo Alto, San Francisco, any of our bigger other, regional cities and counties, they have much bigger numbers than we do because they have more land area. They have different access to certain transportation networks, so on and so forth, as well as that there's certain components that actually are factored in because of the amount of jobs. So there's quite a bit that goes into the regional allocation component. But from there, once the city receives the regional allocation, ours being 1,958 units for the 8-year planning period, is then we have to find the sites that are going to actually be able to serve the quote unquote capacity that would potentially render housing development on the site. So with that being said, is the city has to, through the identification of sites, create the regulatory environment which will influence or create the potential production of housing, and that this is something that has to explicitly follow the technical guidance that is established by HCD. So all jurisdictions are held to the same sites inventory and criteria analysis that has to be applied when selecting sites in a jurisdiction. So that's kind of the background story of what sites inventory is, but then what the methodology is for main prongs, which is, does the parcel allow for a residential use? Is the parcel vacant or underutilized? If non-vacant, then there is what the ILV, another acronym, is improvement to land value. So it has to be under the 1:0 ratio. There's also the criteria as if it was built before 1980, just because of the age of the structure. That's what you call the aging out, especially when it's a non-residential use. The life expectancy of a building sometimes, obviously, just through attrition of needing certain improvements that aren't made over several years, ends up triggering that to be a qualifying site. There's also the trigger is to have consideration of if there is the existing residential use on a site, if something was for a public use, such as a park, a utility, a school, or some type of an infrastructure, so a water district, so on and so forth. Those are things that is really hard to get away from that basic need of the jurisdiction. And then obviously you have to, which the fourth criteria is to check or verify the infrastructure and site conditions to essentially make sure that if you were to build a site or build out a site, that there is infrastructure access. So this one is more so for what we would consider edge cities or unincorporated county areas, because that is for folks that really don't have access to sewer or water. So there's that kind of trigger point. We don't have that issue for that particular criteria in the city. So jumping into required programs, what a required program is that obviously the 6 cycle housing element, as I said, is the programs are essentially our roadmap of how we implement our housing element. Each program establishes, what the city is going to do as our action in order to implement the overview of the topic or what the program actually is, the specific steps that we outline that we are going to take in order to implement, a time frame by when we will do so, and then funding sources, which for the city of Los Altos is predominantly the general fund. And then what is our quantified objective at the end of the day with our specific program that we've established. So actually jumping into the programs that are the ones that have kind of triggered this community meeting most recently, and were considered at the Planning Commission meeting in October on the 19th, and we'll be going forward to the City Council next week, is Program 1A, which is to rezone for the arena shortfall. I'm going to kind of cover just on the following slides what's underlined and in red, because that's kind of the main meat and potatoes of each program. Is that the separate programs detail specifics of various zoning or rezoning actions that would provide additional capacity for all income levels. So essentially this is the kind of catch-all program that says that we will facilitate our arena zoning or allocation, and we will make sure that we implement it in order to make the capacity for housing production to be available. Program 1B is the city will, this is for facilitating higher density in the commercial thoroughfare. So the commercial thoroughfare, or the CT zone, is the city's share or side of El Camino Real. So about 90% of all parcels immediately adjacent or just off of El Camino Real are zoned in the CT zone, or the commercial thoroughfare. As a part of this action, the city will remove or increase the density maximum and increase the height allowed in the CT district by at least 10 feet or 1 story, which will result in a maximum of 55 feet and 5 stories. So existing is 4 stories, and 45 feet is the maximum that could be achieved. This will also include the city removing increased setback standards when across the street or abutting residential zoning districts. So the existing zoning standards has some outdated language that prior to the city in 2021 adopting objective design standards had just a spatial distance requirement in order to be able to ensure a safeguard to the abutting or nearby residential zoning districts. So when the city adopted the 2021 objective design standards, which do facilitate those same principles that are there to help ensure the design does not further impact the immediate or adjacent neighbors, is that we needed to essentially undo the setbacks that were increased when a building was built over a certain height or story count. So program 1C is to allow housing in the office administrative district. So that's the OA district. Most understandable is that this is all of the non-residential developed parcels that are just south of City Hall. So everything that borders essentially the downtown area that is just adjacent to the Civic Center property between here and Foothill Expressway. So this will be to allow for multifamily development with a minimum density of 20 units per acre and a maximum density of 30 units per acre. So the 2030 dwelling units per acre is an important one to keep in mind, is that that number is what is called default density, which was established by the state with the HCD. And that is essentially a default density that is available for jurisdictions to be able to utilize without having to configure their own essentially default density to apply to sites in the jurisdiction. So this is to be able to further create the regulatory environment for housing production. So program 1E is to update the Loyola Corner specific plan. The Loyola Corner specific plan will be rescinded and revert to the underlying zoning of CN. This program includes the removal of all standards that are more restrictive than the applicable within the CN district. So there is language that does specifically talk about whether or not the Loyola Corner specific plan were to be rescinded or not. Is that the development standards and criteria for any housing would still revert to the CN district. And so this is to inevitably increase building heights and to create greater flexibility in unit sizes, as there are some outdated land use actions that have been taken by previous councils, such as a moratorium in Loyola Corners, unit mix and size requirements that made it quite restrictive, as well as a height limitation, which previously was a maximum of 30 feet. So program 1F is to rezone the Village Court parcel. Village Court is the development that is at the corner of El Camino Real and San Antonio, just adjacent to essentially the Chef Chu's property on the side of our share of El Camino Real. The Village Court parcel, located at 4546 El Camino Real, will be rezoned from R110 to Commercial Thoroughfare, the CT zone, and modifications made to the planned unit development PUD as necessary for consistency with the CT district. So one of the things that is important to point out about program 1F and the rezone of the Village Court parcel is that this is what in land use and planning what we call split lot zoning. So there is portions of the parcel that carry one zoning district, and then there's other portions of the parcel that carry another zoning district. This is in general a conflict with how you would do land use planning efforts, and it's essentially anytime something has ever come up in my professional career, when you have split zone districts, you really end up figuring out which one is going to be the highest and best use for that zone, and then it takes over the entire parcel because it does become quite a land use pinch point for any potential development. And actually, it's important to point out is, and we're going to talk about this because the Village Court parcel was identified in the 5th cycle housing element. And so that's what actually program 1G is to rezone housing sites from the previous cycle and allow the development to occur by right. So the fundamental issue is that the Village Court parcel was identified close to a decade ago in the 5th cycle housing element. And so that parcel is statutorily required to be rezoned in order to allow for housing by right. So that particular parcel will not be able to come off the inventory based on the fact that it was identified close to a decade ago. Program 1I is to allow residential care facilities consistent with state law. So this is a lot of times folks don't even know that they're living next to a single family home that has potentially 4, 5, 6 elderly living in the home, but they are not of a typical familiar status in regards to that they're not related, but for all intents and purposes, it's a small care facility. State law does require for these to be permitted in any residential zoning district as it is defined by law. And this is essentially for a consistency ordinance with state law. Program 3J is to explicitly allow manufactured homes consistent with state law. So the city of Los Altos, this has already been common practice. This is something that is essentially the city coming into just consistency with state law, but also asserting state law in our local ordinance to ensure that future staff, as well as applicants and interested parties, would know that the regulations in the city are in effect, which is in any single family zone, we would apply the same standards of any single family home that is already built in Los Altos is if someone wanted to build a lot, the same exact home, but it's a pre-manufactured type of construction, that we would allow it and there would be no local barriers. Most people that I've talked to about this specific program in Los Altos kind of raise an eyebrow and say, well, yeah, what's the big deal? But there are some jurisdictions in the state that have had opposition locally that has essentially necessitated cities to assert the compliance with state law. So I'm gonna quickly kind of go over this as I've previously done in prior discussions, which is the risk liability among compliance and loss of permit authority. So as the city of Los Altos, I know is very familiar, our residents, as the town crier has previously reported, the receipt of multiple builder's remedy applications in our neighboring town of Los Altos Hills. The city of Los Altos is also in receipt of one builder's remedy application, which we received during what we would call our review window. That is a property that's on First Street and it is proposed to be 6 stories. There is nothing the city can legally do in order to not approve that. That project is deemed complete as proposed. We were in that window period where we had no local zoning land use decision-making authority until we were to be found certified by the state of California. The city was found to be in substantial compliance with housing law on September 5th of 2023, which then put us into not being in jeopardy of receiving additional builder's remedy applications. So for all intents and purposes, we are lucky that we received one and only application at the time. I will say that it is important to note is that the application that the city did receive was for a previous development application that was initially proposed to be 4 stories. It's a really good example of a housing project development that had been put through multiple rounds of iteration for close to 2 years with the city's planning department. And received various feedback, various direction, which is kind of what the whole intent of the majority of housing laws has been up until this point, which is to peel back the layers of some of these kind of ongoing issues that land development has seen in the last several years. But to backtrack, what builder's remedy is what is most commonly referred to as a zoning vacation. So this was established in the Housing Accountability Act of 2017. And this means that during when you're found to be in builder's remedy territory, is that no development standards are enforceable. So you are left with the only line of defense in land use, which is your general plan based density. So anything such as height, building, setbacks, parking, none of that is applicable when you are legally allowed to receive building or builder's remedy applications. What's important to note is because the city did not have a legally compliant or in substantial compliance housing element until September 5th, is that if the city were to come out of substantial compliance with housing law and for our housing element to be decertified by the state of California, is we would immediately re-enter into builder's remedy territory. During that time, we would then be susceptible to receiving builder's remedy applications for any parcel that allows residential uses or has been built previously with a residential use until we are found to be in compliance again. The minimum in order to kind of get back into compliance runs essentially between 90 and 120 days. It really depends on how quickly you and expeditiously you can make the corrections and adopt them locally, or essentially rescind or undo whatever local land use action has been taken. So it is a quite rigorous process. I don't know of any jurisdictions professionally that have ever been able to do it within a 90-day period, but that's essentially the bare minimum of how long it would leave the city susceptible. The reason why I say that is that the California state law does afford HCD 60 days to review any jurisdiction in non-compliance. So it leaves you open and susceptible to any type of builder's remedy application. In addition to builder's remedy specifically, there are penalties for non-compliance. Financial penalties, which courts can multiply financial penalties by a factor of 6. This is important in Southern California. There was a jurisdiction that was just held to this standard. The initial fine was $150,000. That would be multiplied times 6. And that decision was just rendered last week. Legal suits and attorney fees, this is on top of the fines. And then obviously any other potential things that are associated with the legal suits. There is also the loss of state funding, SB1 grant specifically, and regional transportation funding opportunities. So the things that end up improving a lot of our road networks. A lot of folks don't know is that the cities and jurisdictions all through California receive a significant amount of state level funding, obviously through revenue streams such as gas taxes and so on and so forth. So if you are found to be in non-compliance, you are not eligible to receive money and reimbursement for those expenditures that the city incurs. And then last is the loss of permitting authority through general plan inadequacy. This is important to at least explain, is that a lot of folks don't really understand is that when I said previously that a jurisdiction in California has 7 required elements, housing is one of them. So if your housing element is decertified or to be found in non-compliance or not in substantial compliance with housing law, or the city takes an action that is in opposition of the adopted housing element, when that housing element is then decertified, your entire general plan is null and void as it's inadequate. You have to have all 7 elements in place and intact in order to be able to have an adequate general plan. At that time, the jurisdiction can be placed into court receivership. As I previously mentioned at the last community meeting that was held last week, is I do want to convey is that these things are very real. The Bay Area jurisdictions are kind of struggling and grappling with what Southern California started dealing with a solid 3 to 4 years ago when they were going through the development and initial adoption and initial implementation of their 6 cycle housing elements, because they were reviewed 2 years ago because they were the start of the 6 cycle. And all of these have been very real penalties that have been affecting Southern California jurisdictions. I previously have worked for one of the 2 jurisdictions that had lost their permitting authority. So it is very real and it is a repercussion of general plan inadequacy. So kind of closing out our PowerPoint, one things that I do want to kind of touch on is the rezoning due date. If the folks in the room have looked at some of the adopted general plan language, is that you'll see some dates that would appear to the public as that we're moving quicker than we are required to. That is inaccurate. The city adopted our housing element in January earlier this year, which had our initial due dates that we were allowed to kind of play with when you are going to essentially, hopefully, in hopes, be adopted and certified on time. Because the city was not found to be in substantial compliance with housing law by the end of May 2023, so 120 days after the adoption due date of January 31, 2023. As I said previously, we were going to be in compliance September 5th, so several months later. We then triggered a penalty already. So the penalty is that the city has to complete all rezoning no later than January 31, 2024. If we do not finish the rezoning, which the package that I covered with the programs tonight are the rezoning that would keep the city in compliance with our adopted housing element. If we were to not do that by January 31, 2024, the city will receive a notice of violation from HCD stating that we are in conflict with our adopted housing element and we run the risk of being decertified. When you receive a notice of violation from HCD, you generally get about 30 days. And I say about, it's because it depends on what action, if it's been taken in opposition, or if you're just lagging to do your final action, in order to satisfy the adopted programs. So it is something that obviously we need to be cognizant of, which is why there are some of the due dates that you may have seen in the housing element. Some of them are projected to be done at the end of 2025, giving us another 2 years. We no longer have that due date, which means that we have essentially 2.5 more months to complete the actions that are before you tonight. So the next steps that I'm going to cover quickly is that, as I mentioned previously, is that this recommendation of the programs that I have discussed directly tonight have already made its way to the Planning Commission, and that action was completed for a recommendation on October 19th, so earlier last month. And that the City Council public hearings will have a first reading next week on Tuesday, November 14th, and a second reading for adoption on November 28th. So with that is, we're going to turn it over and Gabe will kind of talk real quick.
Sorry, I just want to add 2 items. A number of people came up at the end of the last town hall, and they asked me before we started questions to go over a lot of the answers you're going to hear tonight. You're going to hear Nick or I say, this is state law, we're preempted. It takes place prior to our local zoning code. And sometimes we don't get into that until the third or fourth question. Nick did a great job of covering it tonight, but you are required to comply with state law. How this law is complied with, a lot of it is prescriptive by the state, but you are given some policy choices. So the second point I want to make before we kick off questions is an early policy decision that the city council made was that we wouldn't rezone any single family homes to be compliant with the housing element update. So all the maps behind Freddie, almost everything you see in white, almost all of it, not all of it, almost all of it is what's known as R1 single family zone. And so when we made the policy decision not to rezone single family homes to comply with the housing element update, that means all of the other zones had to bear the burden of the density. So we'll get questions tonight. Why did you do it here, not there? Usually the answer to that is because there is no there anymore. We decided as a community not to rezone single family, and that is the vast majority of how the city is zoned. So with that, Freddie, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Gabe. We're going to take questions from the audience, and would you like to have the first question? Yeah. Thank you.
So how do we incentivize developers to build housing units such as fee simple, low impact housing units that protect the privacy of homeowners whose property is adjacent to rezoned commercial areas in Los Altos? I just want to clarify, i.e., which I know you can't be as prescriptive, townhouses, maybe the OA district, or townhouses with property that abuts in the CN district, the 8 families that are there. So that's the first question.
So there's a number of things the city council can do to incentivize the types of development that we want to see. I'm going to ask Nick before we continue on this to explain no net loss and what happens if a community decides I forget how you worded it, but to protect the character of the neighborhood, we are going to limit the densification that's allowed in the rezoning, and what happens if we fall under no net loss.
So I think that's a really important thing, and it's quite a complex scenario. Is that there is an additional provision which is commonly referred to as no net loss. So the city has to plan for the capacity at bare minimum 1,058 units, which is our RENA allocation. We have done that. But every jurisdiction also has to provide what is referred to as a buffer. We have also done that. We have a buffer that as of right now is, I think, probably about an extra 25 to 30% of that number. The issue is that we are at the point where you cannot require, by local ordinance and even by state law, you can't require over a certain threshold of those units that get built to be affordable. It really ends up depending on what the market yields. Because things such as redevelopment agencies no longer are around, as well as we as a local jurisdiction cannot build the affordable housing ourselves. So it is essentially, as collaborative as a process as it can be, is to work with the developers, and help influence by creating the regulatory environment that will allow for them to create as many affordable units, but also even the market rate units. So one thing I'm gonna somewhat kind of bounce a little bit in this conversation so that people kind of understand the overall concept. 1,958 units is not all affordable. Some of those units, really close to half essentially for easy number purposes are above moderate units for our allocation. And then the rest of them is kind of divided between the three main lower income levels, which is very low, low, and moderate. So with that being said, is that we are going to have to build more at market rate units in addition to the other half of that essentially 2,000 units. So half and half essentially. Well, we've created the capacity to zone and allow for that many units. But at the end of the day, and this does happen quite frequently in jurisdictions, is that the market or the developer doesn't yield the capacity that the land technically can carry. So how many units we plan for in our housing element on a specific site, I will use a site that previously has been discussed in the last couple of months, is the Rancho Shopping Center. A lot of folks in the community asked is, well, the sites in your adopted housing element says essentially 240 units on it. Well, if the developer or future property owner, whomever, were to develop that parcel and they only wanted to do townhomes, for example, and they were only able to get 100, we now have to come up with 140 unit capacity somewhere else in the city, if we don't have enough buffer left. So like I said, as our buffer kind of is teetering between 25-30%. So once you start seeing your development build out of the sites that have been identified, and if they do not carry the capacity that you are anticipating, you then are at the risk of whittling away your buffer and triggering no net loss. So when you trigger no net loss, it means that we have a set amount of days by state statute to add those units and create the capacity again in the jurisdiction. Otherwise, your housing element is decertified and you trigger a builder's remedy. So it's kind of a constant ebb and flow that you have to be able to monitor the overall capacity of a site.
So to wrap up the answer, the types of developments you ask to incentivize are value statements that I don't know that the council would want to incentivize that type of development. So I think the council wants a mix of development that is market driven, that meets the types of housing that are required under housing element update. They can make choices to incentivize less dense homes. They can make choices to incentivize different types of properties, but the no net loss, when you hit that, it ends up being counterintuitive. But the second you go to builders
loss, but if you take like 5150 El Camino, back part of the property is townhomes, and that was approved by the city and city council. So I don't see why they would not want to duplicate that in other places.
Roberta's, for the sake of the recording, and let's not have too many follow-up questions, please. Roberta's saying 5150 El Camino was approved by council with townhomes at the back.
And I think that's a good example of looking at a development where that makes sense.
Right.
But I don't think we would roll out a program that incentivizes attempts to replicate that specific development over and over again.
Okay, next question.
A clarification question, please. I think you said no rezoning of R1, but one of the zoning things was to allow residential care facilities in all zoning districts. So isn't that a change to R1? Thank you.
That's a consistency with state law, so that's already in effect as of today. So whether or not, we amend our local zoning code, if anybody in this room wanted to do that at your single family home, if that's the building type you live in the town, we will process it accordingly, and it doesn't matter what's in our code, it's a state law. So again, that's a consistency with, the state statute.
Other questions?
Yes. I'm Maggie Gay. Thanks for coming.
Can you please put this up?
Can you hear me? Right. I'm just curious, we've identified where housing can go, but do we have any sense of developers who really want to build in these areas? Do you have what happens if someone doesn't want to develop Loyola, or doesn't want to develop Rancho, or doesn't want to develop El Camino? Given the economic climate right now, maybe they wouldn't want to. So what will happen in that case?
So I think, to directly, answer your question, there's been a lot of interest in redeveloping Loyola Corners. There's several council, study sessions that have happened, as recent as 4 or 5 years ago. Those development, applications did not proceed because of the limitation that was discussed or placed on them. So if those continue to re-unearth, we would see development occur. For all intents and purposes, there is now city-owned land that was not city-owned land where there was residential units proposed on it. And I'm referring to 99 Fremont. That is public information. It was published in the newspaper. Everyone is very well aware of that. The city council at the time had bought the property. That's now city property. So there previously was a development application for residential. So I think the interest is there. And the current market conditions, that's absolutely something that all jurisdictions are going to struggle with, because the interest rates, the carrying cost, and the actual development costs. We have quarries that are closing, which are a local supply chain for cement. There's a lot of different kind of independent functions of what creates the developments that would need to occur. So the city needs to take action on what we can control. So obviously we're never going to be able to control supply chain. But if for some reason the regulatory environment wasn't to influence it significantly enough, and we weren't to enter into a major economic downturn like the one in 2007, 8, and 9. Hopefully we do not. I would not like to see that either again. But if that's not a part of the equation, I think that the state fundamentally is going to look at exactly what we have implemented, and then ask us to essentially look back and say, did we do enough? And there's not a silver bullet or a perfect way to answer that, is that they would require us to essentially show the work and potentially really what we have been doing all of this year since the housing element has been adopted, is really kind of making sure that when we do have some expressed interest in development applications, that we do notate some of those things so that we can start telling our story as a jurisdiction. Because there is, as I think some people in the room have heard, is like our development pipeline. So projects that are either currently in development, currently under review, or recently approved and entering into building permits, is that those projects are things that help tell our story essentially. As just recently was, mentioned in tonight, is someone mentioned 5150. 5150 was approved several years ago. Well, guess what? Really good news is that almost 200 units that was approved under the last housing element cycle, that counts towards our sixth cycle. It counts when you pull a building permit. It doesn't count when you entitle things standalone. However, the entitling them does tell the story to show that if we entitle, let's say, half of the units, over the next few years, that we have strong development potential to occur the next several years during the planning period. So this is something that is definitely logged and tracked in what is called the annual APR, or annual progress report, which is provided to HCD. And there's multiple sheets of a spreadsheet that is required to be logged and tracked and uploaded to HCD, which talks about applications submitted for, applications approved, applications denied, ADUs produced, single family homes produced, so on and so forth. It gets really granular with the detail and data that's provided back to the state so that they can actually look at where in essentially each local jurisdiction, where's the sticking point, what's stopping it. Because if someone gets all the way to a building permit, that usually means that it's something not in the regulatory environment. So this is going to be a really important next few years in our annual reporting that will be able to essentially show that narrative back to the state.
And just adding a piece to that real quick, when you go through the matrix that the state used to qualify sites, they were intentional, right? They were sites that were maybe not being used to the highest economic output, that haven't been turned over in some time, that are older, that are large. And when you incentivize development on those sites, as the state has done, it makes it more likely to develop. So certainly it comes down to the property owner making a decision, a business decision being made, especially what type of development. But the way the state designed the matrix to get sites approved were sites that would more likely develop than other sites that could have been sold.
Hi, I had a question about kind of a practical question, but some of these sites, like say Rancho or Loyola Corners, that might get redeveloped with a lot of residential units, are there regulations around maintaining, say, retail and shopping spaces? Or is that simply up to the city council to enforce on their whim, or is it up to the developer? How is that kind of either regulated or enforced or monitored?
So using the Rancho site specifically, when that went to council made a decision that they wanted to try and retain a mixed use commercial development on the ground floor. So council can make that a requirement, but that doesn't mean that's how it will be developed. So when we look at these sites, council can state their preferences. Council can even pass ordinances that require it. But under state law, it doesn't necessarily have to be developed that way. And there are some trade-offs, particularly in height, if you try and require commercial development, and then that commercial doesn't ultimately develop and stays residential. So largely that's a policy question that council spent a lot of time on with Rancho specifically. I imagine they'll spend some time on it with the other sites as well.
So Nick, I appreciate your answers to the questions, particularly around net loss, and I realize that these issues are complex. On the other hand, there are things that the city and city staff and council can do which don't decrease the number of units on a site, but do address specific concerns that residents have with the potential of having a 40, 50, 60-foot building 10 feet away from their rear property line. And That's unfortunately a real possibility. So my question is not how do we decrease the number of units? My question really is city staff and the city council open to changes that mitigate the negative impact of large structures close to property lines? Those are things like reducing plate height. We have unlimited plate height at this point, and developers have used that as a loophole on El Camino to get increased height to the building. We have issues around things like setbacks and putting in an absolute minimum setback that's allowed. Yes, we have setbacks to residential neighborhoods, but we have all the local and state mandated give backs, and then we have the developer's ability to ask for anything they want. And that can have a very negative effect on residential neighborhoods. We have things like in the OA district, where staff is proposing allowing mixed use, which increases the height of the building. If we eliminate mixed use, that saves at least 5 feet. My question is staff and city council open to some of those kinds of changes that don't create a net decrease in capacity?
In short, yes. I know I speak on behalf of the council that obviously as long as there's not a net decrease to capacity, yes, this and city staff is supportive of that. What I would say in full transparency is the ordinance that I personally drafted is that's a huge divergence from what was an intentional requirement that was requested in the CN district. And that's fine. That's a perfectly suitable divergence that could be there. But as you previously have asked, Mr. Bear, I will also at least acknowledge and essentially inform, but also accept is that if a developer were to request density bonus on one of these properties, they are allowed to request mixed use zoning. So they would be allowed to do that type of use no greater than 1/3 of the total square footage of the site. So there still are avenues. So one of the things, and I say we talked about this very robustly in several different sessions at the state planning conference, where I actually was a speaker on housing element implementation, was that the multiple sessions specifically talked about creating the regulatory environment that essentially keeps developers away from wanting to deploy density bonus. You create the local regulatory environment that keeps them at the building height. I will say, and I will expressively agree to disagree with you, Mr. Bear, regulating plate heights is going to 100% trigger a developer to deploy density bonus, which opens them up to any development standard change. And the reason why I say that is, so if anybody doesn't know what density bonus is, government code 65915, I have a very intimate, close relationship with it, as I've written multiple ordinances and jurisdictions for that government code. Is that specifically you are allowed to request what's called incentives or concessions, which is essentially one and the same, or a waiver. So if there is something that is deemed to be essentially a physical preclusion for the development to occur, it can be waived. It's essentially an administrative variance by virtue of the request, because it's very hard to deny an incentive, concession, or waiver. The reason why it's important to at least acknowledge that is incentives, concessions, and waivers have to fundamentally be challenged by a health and safety provision, which is very hard to prove in regards to the actual development that is being proposed. or that it's not actually financially, benefiting the property, which the burden of proof is on the city. And there is no standard that a city can require for a developer to prove the financial, benefit that they would be, rendered from the change in the development standard that they would be afforded under density bonus. So it's a very complex thing. I know that that sometimes isn't necessarily the warm fuzzy that a community wants to hear is to, okay, well, let's regulate the things that we want to regulate. I can tell you that plate height, this is the first jurisdiction out of 4 that I've worked for in the state of California where I regulated plate height. So it's a very uncommon, outdated land use practice, which plate height, so it's a ceiling height. So, is that it, in developers fundamentally, most people, I'm 6'3", I wouldn't wanna live in a plate height with, 8'6". That would feel very congested to me, in my personal opinion. So that's essentially though, what you would hear from a developer if you were to install, an across the board ceiling height limitation. So it is a fundamental that it's one of those things that the city has looked at previously. But the fundamental issue is that you talk about all of these variety of kind of like the land use or planning toolbox to craft or design the building. When really fundamentally jurisdictions have been having to grapple with, do we care about what the inside of someone's ceiling is like, or do we care about how tall the ultimate building is? You can't have both anymore, fundamentally. So that's one of those things that we have to, kind of decide is that, are you caring about the building height or are you caring about the plate height? A lot of times also, one of the things that I will say is a lot of folks will say, well, but we don't want to just see a bunch of flat roof buildings. It looks boring, it's architecturally, just not appealing to have everything be, a flat, essentially building height skyline that you see. Well, the way that you get away from that is that you allow some increased height to allow for a pitched roof. Because if you kind of just do the simple, visual, if you look at your own, single family home, the pitched roof area of your house is usually attic space, which isn't usable. Well, when you build a flat roof structure, you get more usable space and a lower profile. So that's one of those things is, again, does the community care about the ultimate building height, or do you care about having architectural emphasis at the roof line?
I have a question. My family church, which is the Methodist Church at Magdalena, wound up on the housing element for Los Altos, and I believe it's still there. The church congregation was not aware that it had been placed there. I understand there are 2 other churches on Magdalena that are on the housing element site. And I understand that the churches cannot, evidently the city can just put the church on the housing element. I understand that. But my question is, what is HCD doing to try to eliminate churches in this state? I think it's a value issue and they ought to be called on it, because if they had done this to our high schools or other areas, they would be called on it. But to them, the church has no value.
So fundamentally, the churches have seen a significant amount of redevelopment all across the state of California. I worked in a jurisdiction that had a very large parcel owned by the Greek Orthodox Church. The Greek Orthodox Church parceled off 5 acres of the site and is building 100 units of 100% affordable for seniors. This is in Southern California in San Diego County. It is a part of the foundational principles of any religious institution in order to have traditional charitable contributions, and it is something that you see with Catholic Archdiocese that have rectories on site. Those are affordable units. The Jesuit Center that is located here in Los Altos has affordable units on the site, whether or not people know it or not. So there have been fundamental churches all across California that haven't scrape and build. And actually, the city of Los Altos did not account for the entire site. So this is one of those things that the city would be happy to discuss with the church sites. And I have talked to actually one of them. And that it is not the entire site that was accounted for redevelopment. It's for open parking space areas that are on the site, that if they would like to respond as a part of their charitable kind of contribution of building affordable housing, that they could do so, and it creates the regulatory environment. There's also other state laws, regardless of if we put it on the inventory, opens up all religious institution sites for the potential of redevelopment with housing.
So very briefly, she was asking, does HCD have something against churches and religious organizations? So are you able to answer that question? That's the question. Yes or no?
Not to my knowledge.
Okay, thank you for clarifying. Okay.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. I know you've done a lot of hard work and then coming to a new job with a lot of history and having to accomplish something, it's really hard. But also so I congratulate you on that. But also as a resident who's paying a lot of taxes, we have a right to understand how these changes are going to affect our neighborhood, specifically for the village court. You said that it's going to be changed to CT zone. In your presentation, I read that you're going to be contacting the property owners in the adjacent areas, and that hasn't been done yet. You also said that it's coming to the city council November 14, and that's next Tuesday, less than a week. So how can we work together so that help you implement these changes, but also understand how it affects us? Because I haven't seen any specific information on village court and the adjacent properties. So how can we get that information, like a 2-page summary that explains with these new changes, what is the building height, what's the setback, how does it affect the people who are right behind them? Because the city zone, you said it's like 55 plus 55 5 stories. And if you add the density bonus, that will be another 65, 60 stories. And you said the setback that was increased was taken away. So what is the setback? So what are the details? I'm interested in the exact details of what are we looking at?
So the building heights that you just articulated are the building heights that will be for the CT zone, and specifically the village court parcel. Something that was included in the village court parcel was the language about that the city would consult and work with in consultation with the adjacent neighbors village court. However, that was with the original timeline of 2 years from now. Fundamentally, the changes that are being implemented are explicitly called out in that program, which is the increase of 10 feet and then the removal of increased setback requirement. So there's not really for the CT zone anything that's being kind of creatively proposed, rather than an amendment to the height and a strike through of increased setbacks for the CT zone. One of the things that I will continue to inform and educate and explain is that in 2021, the city took the time and investment to develop the objective design standards. The objective design standards were a way for the city to maintain the local control that was taken away in the Housing Crisis Act and the Housing Accountability Act for the requirement of the city to only apply objective design standards. So previously, the city had extensive amounts of just subjective design standards, or things that we would only negotiate from the dais, essentially with the planning commission, design review commission, and even at the city council level. You can't do that anymore pursuant to state law. So we adopted, after developing and spending a good amount of time in developing the objective design standards, adopted those into each individual section of the zoning code. So there are things that are considered the protections that are built into building design now. So there wasn't a hard and fast requirement for things that we would require. So any structure that's in the CT zone would now be required for anything above 2 stories has to do what's considered a step back. So it has to step back every additional essentially layer of the cake or story of the building. It has to pull it back and build it back further away from certain adjacencies in the immediate area. And that's one, to help provide vertical and horizontal relief to the building, but inevitably, that's what we call it architecturally. We call it the adjacent neighbor kind of protection and also design preference that has always been a requirement or a desired requirement in the city. But all that being said, is this was adopted 2 years ago, almost to date. There has not been a single application approved in the city of Los Altos since that time. That's COVID time, and that's also a lot of development applications that were already in essentially in process for review with the planning commission and the city council. So we will see development applications come in that will be applying new objective design standards, which will be a protection. But specifically, the one comment that was just made about the city not engaging, immediate neighbors to the village court area, it's simply because the 2 criteria of changing that site are explicitly called out in the housing element. What's also really important to at least note is that in the 6-cycle housing element, all jurisdictions were required to really provide explicit directives of what they were going to do in their future and forthcoming actions. In land use law and the hierarchy of planning documents in the state of California, your general plan is the highest governing document in the jurisdiction. So whatever the housing element says dictates the zoning. It's not the other way around. So the fact of the matter is that the adopted housing element dictates what the height will be and also what the setback requirement will be. So if a development application were to come in for village court tomorrow and we weren't to take final action on this, the housing element prevails and means that the zoning application would be approved as the adopted housing element has been drafted, which would be a 10-foot increase in height and an elimination of increased setbacks.
So what is the setback?
I would have to pull that up for the specific district, but I don't have that off the top of my head.
Thanks a lot for your work. Couple of questions. This identifying Rancho and Loyola Corners as possible sites for the development. My question is, what if the owner of the site doesn't want to sell? Number 2, if the owner of the site sells, but the buyer wants to keep the area the way it is, for example, he buys Rancho to a new buyer. And the buyer says, I want to maintain Rancho as it is. It's part of the community, it's part of Los Altos. Will, number 1, the city allow the buyer to have that option? And number 2, if the owner of the property does not ever want to sell, would the city implement eminent domain in that situation? Oh, finally, one other. If you're gonna build 5-story buildings, I would like the building poles, I think they're called, that go up in the air. I really would like to see those, particularly at Rancho. Thank you.
So as a part of the adopted housing element, story poles have been eliminated from being allowed in the city of Los Altos. So story poles will not be seen again for any development application in the city. That was also something that was only done by a city council policy action. And so it's not something that we will see again return in Los Altos. It was determined to be a housing impediment. And is well documented by substantial evidence of a public health and safety risk issue, and was also waived multiple times by the city council in prior actions. So it will not return. In regards to if a site were to not redevelop or to not sell, I'm gonna look at those in tandem as one and the same, because at the end of the day, it's not changing what's there today. And that's inevitably what the housing element is attempting to do, is to change the existing land use and development. If that weren't to happen, we would need to explore the development capacity of our other sites, see if it's gonna render. That's actually fundamentally, it's not about that you'll see a lower density build out of sites, while you have a buffer. It's that some of them you fundamentally, period, you have leaseholds that you can't kind of get out of sometimes with national vendors. Or banks sometimes, FDIC, if you have an FDIC insured bank, it is increasingly difficult sometimes to move the actual financial institution in and of itself without going through the very rigorous notification process. The only reason why I know that is I was part of a project in Southern California that had to move a bank, and it took every bit of 2.5 years before they were legally allowed to move the bank from location to location. So unless it literally gets broken into or burns down, it's not moving quickly. So fundamentally is if we didn't see redevelopment occur on sites that have been identified, we would have to, again, look back to the specific capacity that's on the other sites. And then potentially have to provide additional upzoning on sites that are already there. Because I do think that the community is still going to want to preserve the R1 zoning district for as long as we possibly can, well into the future. That's also one of the important things is, there was a question earlier today that I responded to in an email and I don't know if the gentleman's in the room or not, is that, well, where was it that it was explicitly called out that the council wanted to preserve and protect the R1 zone? Well, here's the fundamental issue is that you take a parcel, and let's talk about Rancho since it's been brought up multiple times tonight, that's a 6-acre site. We all know that most of the homes immediately adjacent to the Rancho Shopping Center are nowhere near 6 acres in its total site area. So how many sites are immediately adjacent that would quantify 6 acres of total land area? Let's say 20 homes. You're talking about going from one property owner of Rancho Shopping Center to now having to acquire and redevelop 20 different property owners. That really doesn't work into the site analysis and inventory criteria that is a part of the state level guidance. So that's one of those things where you can't, even some jurisdictions that attempted to do that, oh, we're just gonna rezone all our single family zoning districts. Well, you can't really do that because you know that a lot of folks are not gonna wanna do that, because now you're dealing, instead of with a small pot of property owners, you're dealing with thousands. And so that's where that's part of that state level guidance of site selection criteria. You cannot execute eminent domain for things like this.
So we have 2 questions. I actually have 3 questions over on this side, and we're gonna ask people, keep them short, and Nick, in due respect, please, if you can keep yours short too, that'd be great.
I think I asked this question last time, but I'll ask it again, but why aren't we trying to fight the state legally? And I think you mentioned Huntington Beach was in the process of doing that. And it would cost the city $7 million in lawyers, attorney fees or something. But if there's a coalition of cities, and looks like most cities are not happy with this housing element. Is that not a possibility? Are we looking into that?
So, no, we're not looking into fighting that. We wouldn't fight it, primarily because, we would lose. Secondly, because we've complied with the state law, and at this point, if we wanted to fight it, if council wanted to make a policy decision to fight it, they could do that politically at the state level. But it would, even if you don't like the law and you don't want to comply, if you look at the matrix of worst outcomes, it would be don't comply while you're fighting it, because the law is set up, right, to incentivize development. You'd be into builder's remedy, you'd be into all sorts of outcomes that you wouldn't want.
My question is quick. The area near San Antonio, like Hawthorne and Pepper, the OA district, do we know, are there any developer interests on those area already?
Yes, there is.
So if we fail to build the number of units required, will HCD decertify us or would they make us rezone R1?
The city, no jurisdiction in the state of California is required to build these. We're required to create the regulatory environment. And if we receive applications, we are required to process them accordingly with our local regulations and any state law that they deploy as a part of their application. So no, if we play by the rules, we will not run the risk of being decertified.
And so then the other part, will they ever make us rezone R1? If we don't come up with enough?
I mean, I don't want to say no, because I think there's a lot of variables out on the table, and I don't work for the state, as well as I'm not one of the elected officials at the state legislature. Those are things that are off and out of my purview, but fundamentally is if we make due diligent effort to implement our housing element and chip away at the housing quota or allocation that we have been given, there's no reason to risk or run afoul that we would have to dip into R1, as there's other opportunities to be able to create the housing in the city.
Thank you. I have one here.
I was wondering if you could comment on the latest thinking for the Woodland site, like one, just how far it extends, because I know there's like the supermarket, but other small businesses. And then if there's been like a history of developer interest there and what that's been like.
So the gentleman's asking about Woodland, which is most commonly in town referred to as the Lucky's site. So the Lucky's site is, I mean, whatever is bound by their parking lot and around their immediate building. And then there is the immediate, 3 parcels that, you know, goes from the auto body kind of repair shop, then a long skinny, you know, kind of funky oriented, single story commercial, non-residential building, and then another one on the corner. And you know, Lucky's, we do not have significant permit history or essentially improvement history on that site. So that's one of the reasons why it would qualify as a viable site for redevelopment. For all intents and purposes, if anybody opens Google, Lucky's closed 3 local Bay Area stores this week. They only have 30 Lucky's in the state of California, so they closed 10% of their portfolio this quarter. So I mean, I have no control over that, but again, we need to be cognizant as a jurisdiction, because fundamentally, I don't think the jurisdiction, if they were to leave on their own accord, we don't want a vacant shopping center, like with what we have in some of our CT zoning, which is vacancies and things that have turned into blight, as well as significant issues for vandalism and things of that nature. And that is what happens when you have increased large scale vacancies in a jurisdiction. But there has been expressed development or interest, not of Lucky's, so calm down everyone, but in that immediate area of Woodlands. So yes.
Yeah, the question. Suppose the HCD takes issue with the city's implementation of its housing element, or it decides
to decertify our housing element? What are the due process steps that HCD will follow to address whatever problem HCD finds?
So the variety of folks in this room know that this is my fourth housing element that I've helped develop in the state of California. So I would say is if we want to continue to have community meetings of why, I'm teeing up a lot of the programs the way that I have, it is with the known knowledge and actual practice of having to deal with HCD directly about non-compliant or lack of implementation. That's just the background of it. Fundamentally, is that HCD was granted enforcement capability prior to the last couple of years. HCD used to have to go through the general attorney or the attorney general's office. They no longer have to do that. They can, in tandem with the AG's office, move forward with enforcement capabilities, which could kind of the legal suits, the things that I talked about, the non-compliance and risk and liability. So there is the ability that HCD can enforce, fine and decertify. There's a variety of open-ended things that can end up triggering a lot of the repercussions that can be enforced by HCD.
What's the timeline on that?
For what?
The timeline of the HCD is declassification or anything like that? What's the timeline of that?
So if we were to receive a notice of violation, we need to rectify whatever action we have taken within 30 days. If we receive a decertification, we then have a 60-day window of once ever we do whatever we need to do in order to be recertified. That's a bare minimum, and then that's what's going back and forth with the state. The last time that I worked in a jurisdiction that essentially had to go back and forth with what we like to funnily call HCD's concierge service, aka enforcement unit that is on the speed dial with you directly, you go back and forth for several months. So you run the foul of being in builder's remedy for anywhere between 4 to 6 months. It's not ideal.
Thanks for being available tonight and helping us understand this stuff. I have two questions about SB 9. First is, if a number of R1 lots turn into 6 units from single family homes, does that reduce the density requirements of the areas you've talked about tonight? That's the first question. And the second one is there a height limit on a 6-unit development on the R1 lot?
So if someone were to take on SB9, the height limit would be whatever the zoning district dictates. So there's whatever provisions it is. So I mean, for all extents and purposes, let's say it's 30 feet, that's what they would be held to. They wouldn't be able to then just essentially start stacking all of the units under SB9 and create a 6-story building because they're allowed that number of units. SB9 is a ministerial action that allows for the subdivision or the creation of additional units on a single family lot. It's not 6, it's 4. So the max that you can get out of an SB9 is 4 units. So that's what they would be allowed, and they would have to abide by the development criteria that's for that zone.
And what about reducing density? If there are a bunch of R1 lots that become 4 units,
we could only hope so much that then we get more SB9, so then we don't have the risk of triggering no net loss. I will, for all intents and purposes, one of the jurisdictions that I worked in 2021, we adopted the 6-cycle housing element. They triggered no net loss 6 months ago. So a year and a half of validity.
So real quick, we're gonna do about 2 more questions. We want to wrap up at 8:30.
Thanks very much for your explanation, but I don't know if you really discussed what RENA means. I don't know. Everybody in this room is familiar with Regional Housing Needs Authority and whether it's an elected body, or how are they deciding and dictating what's to go into each city based on the numbers that they come up with, based on studies? Because it's been my understanding that there was some controversy around the numbers that they established way back before COVID, way before 3 million people moved out of California. What can you say to this group about RENA, who they are,
And who, I mean, obviously the state is authorizing them, but are they an elected body? And if people in this room don't like what's happening, what can they do?
So RENA is the Regional Housing Needs Allocation or Assessment. You'll hear allocation and assessment used interchangeably. RENA is, so there is what's the COGS, so the Council of Governments. So we're in ABAG. San Diego is SANDAG. Southern California, meaning everything else essentially below Santa Barbara, all the way to San Diego, is SCAG. They're the biggest. They have the most most jurisdictions. Those council of governments have local appointed folks as a part of the council of governments. So that's actually what it's a regional entity that is compiled of all of the other local jurisdictions that all meet collaboratively, get together, talk about how they're going to develop, formulate everything. ABAG, just like any of the other COGS, has their own actual planning staff that obviously takes all of the opinions, views, desires, and kind of objectives of the COG, all of the regional representatives from all the local jurisdictions, and creates what ABAG is going to assign. So ABAG got, let's just say for easy numbers, got assigned 1 million units, let's just say that. And all the other COGs got their allocation as well. Each COG then has to determine how they're going to assign all of the jurisdictions that are in each COG, then they're gonna get how many they're gonna get. The biggest factor is its access and availability to jobs, access to public transit and transportation networks, schools, and other kind of main kind of criteria and resources. Every COG has the ability to develop how their allocation is going to actually work. The city of Los Altos did attempt to appeal our RENA allocation. We attempted to appeal the RENA allocation of the number that was allocated to us. We improperly applied the appeal of the allocation. We should have appealed the way we were determining the RENA allocation for the jurisdiction. And so that's actually a step that we missed our due diligence. You cannot really appeal your allocation if you didn't appeal how you're going to set the criteria of which you are allocated. So we, as a jurisdiction, missed a critical milestone, which is actually some of the only jurisdictions in California that have been successful of receiving somewhat of a reduction. It's not drastic, but somewhat of a reduction, and it's by virtue of appealing the process of how you have been allocated the numbers in regards to how you're creating the quantified metric that each jurisdiction is then provided with their final count from the regional council of government. So in regards to opposition of what the state and regional providers have done, myself and Gabe are not going to speak to that.
I have one question.
Yeah, and to answer, if you don't like it, if you wanted to fight it, that starts at Sacramento, right, at the state level. Just to close up that answer.
There's been a lot of discussion about the city waiving impact fees and how that's going to affect our sewers and our infrastructure, etc. Can you speak to that? Is that something we actually need to be worried about?
No, so the city only committed in our housing element one wave, or two, actually, there's two. I lied, there's two. One is that we have built a 100% affordable project on one of our downtown parking lots, 7 or 8, which is something that we have offered in our housing element, that we would waive the impact fees. This is similar to what we actually did for 330 Distal, which is our collaborative partnership with the county, which is a 90 unit affordable development that is just off of El Camino Real. So we would essentially be mirroring the process that we just did for that 100% affordable project. That's the only one. The only other thing that we would waive permit fees for is for ADUs. So our housing element, which is a very common thing, and it's also a very low amount. ADUs do not cost very much to get a building permit for because they are a smaller unit. It requires less review, so on and so forth. It's one of the ways that jurisdictions have been able to help influence and support ADU production, because actually the construction cost of ADUs is really the most expensive component of actually development of those units in and of themselves. So there isn't impact fees that are gonna be broad spectrum, waived across the board unless we take an additional action, as a city. But one of the things that is important that, Freddie is kind of, bringing up is that, we are also doing a comprehensive fee study update. So we're looking at all of our impact fees to be able to essentially justify and rectify some of the fees that have been established or for quite some time not been updated. And there's also some fees that we don't even have as a jurisdiction, when you look at some of our neighboring folks. So we are looking at that right now, in a nexus study, which is required in order to be, compliant with, an increase or a change of fees. But our building permit rates, we haven't really raised other than CPI in over 2 decades. We have one of the lowest building, valuation, thresholds for building permits. So right now we're subsidizing building permits for everyone in the entire jurisdiction. And that's just the data that, you could pull when you look at some of the building permits. So there are certain things that will come out of, a comprehensive fee update. Some fees, may get reduced. Other fees might come online, like the establishment of affordable housing fee, which is something that we did also talk about, creating in our housing element, or an in lieu housing fee. So there's a lot of different things that are actually going to be quite specific. One of the things that was discussed and mentioned during our recent sewer rate increase, that already was passed and adopted by the council, is there was the question of all these new units and we're paying for some infrastructure improvement. That's not the case. Every time new units come online, they have to pay an impact fee that actually is associated with the additional units and the capacity increase to the sewer system. So by virtue of new units, you will have a significant increase in infrastructure impact fees in order to be able to support the development and creation of a lot of the infrastructure that's required and necessitated when new units and population grows in the jurisdiction.
One follow-up question to my question.
Sure, yeah.
Could we find out at any time without warning that our housing element has been decertified?
No. Okay, you've been very, very generous. You've been very, very generous with your time, and we certainly appreciate it. Thank you so much for doing this for your community. We really do appreciate everything you do.